There's a moment in spiritual awakening that nobody talks about. Not when you gain something profound, but when you suddenly can't do things you've always done. Your soul develops what Carl Jung called spiritual allergies, an inability to participate in patterns that once felt normal but now feel suffocating. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the individuation process, the journey toward becoming your authentic self. Through his work in analytical psychology, he discovered something profound about spiritual awakening and consciousness development. Genuine spiritual growth, Jung observed, doesn't happen through adding new practices or beliefs. It happens through what he termed organic rejection. Your psyche naturally develops an intolerance for anything that conflicts with your emerging authentic self. Jung documented this phenomenon in hundreds of patients, undergoing what he called the psychological transformation of the soul. As these individuals progressed in their personal development, they experienced involuntary changes in behavior that they couldn't control or reverse. A successful businessman came to Jung reporting strange symptoms. "I sit in board meetings and suddenly can't speak," he told Jung, not from anxiety but from disgust. The politics, the manipulation, the pretense, my body literally rejects it. Jung recognized this as what he called authenticity, intolerance, a condition where the awakening psyche refuses to participate in inauthentic patterns, regardless of social or professional consequences. This isn't conscious choice initially. Jung observed that people don't wake up deciding to change their behavior. They wake up realizing they already have. Their soul has quietly been making exits from patterns that no longer serve their psychological evolution. Jung identified 7 specific patterns that awakening individuals inevitably abandon. These aren't moral decisions or spiritual disciplines. They're psychological necessities. Your developing consciousness simply cannot maintain behaviors that contradict your emerging authentic self. Understanding these 7 silent exits, Jung believed, was crucial for anyone experiencing the disorientation of spiritual awakening. You're not losing your mind, you're finding your soul. And your soul has very specific requirements for what it will and won't tolerate. The first pattern Jung observed spiritually awakening people abandon is what he called validation-seeking behavior, the constant, unconscious performance designed to earn others' approval and acceptance. Jung's analytical psychology reveals that approval-seeking serves a crucial function in early psychological development. Children need external validation to develop a sense of self-worth and social belonging. This becomes problematic when adults remain psychologically dependent on others' opinions to feel worthy of existence. Jung documented that as individuals develop genuine self-knowledge through the individuation process, something remarkable happens. Their psyche begins to reject approval-seeking behaviors at a visceral level. A woman came to Jung describing mysterious symptoms. "I used to reshape my entire personality depending on who I was with," she explained. "Now when I try to do that, my body rebels. I feel nauseous, my hands shake. I literally cannot perform for approval anymore." Jung recognized this as the emergence of what he called inner authority, an internal compass that references authentic self rather than external validation. This inner authority doesn't develop gradually. It emerges suddenly when the psyche reaches sufficient maturity. The transformation typically follows a predictable pattern. Jung observed across multiple cases. Stage 1, physical rejection. The body begins refusing to participate in approval-seeking behaviors. You might find yourself unable to laugh at jokes you don't find funny, unable to agree with opinions that contradict your authentic views, or unable to modify your appearance to please others. Stage 2. Social discomfort situations that once felt normal become psychologically uncomfortable. Networking events feel draining rather than exciting. Small talk becomes physically difficult. Social media engagement drops naturally because the dopamine hit from likes and comments no longer satisfies. Stage 3. Identity crisis. If your entire sense of self was built on being liked and approved of, this rejection creates profound disorientation. Jung observed patients going through what felt like identity death. They no longer knew who they were without their approval-seeking persona. Stage 4. Authenticity emergence. After the crisis comes what Jung called authentic self-emergence. The new sense of worth develops that doesn't depend on external validation. This isn't confidence, which still references others, but what Jung termed inherent worth, value that exists, independent of recognition. Jung noted that this transition is particularly difficult for people in careers or relationships built on people-pleasing. A therapist reported to Jung, "I built my entire practice on being the healer everyone loved. When I stopped performing that role, half my clients left. But the ones who stayed began experiencing real healing for the first time." The complete abandonment of approval-seeking, Jung observed, typically takes 2 to 3 years. First you quit seeking validation from strangers, then from acquaintances, then from friends, and finally, most difficult, from family members. Jung emphasized that this isn't rebellion against others, but loyalty to self. The psyche that has discovered its authentic nature cannot betray that nature for social acceptance without experiencing what he called soul sickness, a deep psychological distress that manifests as physical symptoms. The second pattern Jung observed, awakening souls abandon, might seem paradoxical, the need to be special, unique, or superior to others through their spiritual development. Jung's depth psychology revealed that early spiritual awakening often creates what he termed spiritual inflation, an ego identification with spiritual insights that generates feelings of specialness or chosenness. This spiritual inflation, Jung noted, serves a temporary psychological function. It helps individuals separate from collective unconsciousness and begin valuing their inner experience over social conditioning. The problem arises when spiritual inflation becomes a permanent identity rather than a temporary developmental phase. Jung documented numerous cases where individuals became psychologically addicted to being the awakened one among unconscious people. They derived identity and self-worth from being more conscious, more evolved, more spiritually advanced than others. A philosophy professor came to Jung, struggling with what seemed like spiritual superiority. "I can see through everyone's psychological patterns," he reported. "I understand consciousness at levels my colleagues can't reach. I know things about reality that most people will never grasp." Initially, this felt like spiritual achievement to him, but Jung helped him recognize the subtle ego involvement in his spiritual insights. His need to be the most conscious person in any room was actually preventing deeper spiritual development. Jung observed that genuine spiritual maturity requires what he called the death of the special self, releasing identification with being spiritually superior to others. This abandonment follows several distinct phases. Phase 1, recognition of performance. You begin catching yourself subtly, or not so subtly, letting others know about your spiritual experiences, meditation practice, or consciousness insights. The motivation isn't sharing authentic experience, but differentiating yourself from unconscious people. Phase 2, exhaustion with specialness. The need to maintain spiritual superiority becomes psychologically exhausting, constantly comparing your consciousness level to others. needing to be the deepest person in every conversation. Having to maintain your enlightened image, it begins feeling like a prison. Phase 3, humility crisis. Jung observed that many people experience profound humility around this phase, not as a spiritual practice, but as a psychological necessity. You begin seeing your own unconscious patterns so clearly that any sense of superiority becomes impossible to maintain. Phase 4, ordinary enlightenment, the final phase Jung called ordinary enlightenment, becoming completely yourself without needing anyone to notice or validate your spiritual development. You're like a flower that blooms whether anyone's watching or not. One of Jung's most spiritually developed patients described her transformation. I used to need everyone to know I was different, deeper, more awakened. Now I'm happy to be invisible. Being special was exhausting. Being nobody is freedom. Jung emphasized that abandoning specialness doesn't mean abandoning uniqueness. In fact, when you stop performing your specialness, your authentic uniqueness naturally emerges. You become genuinely distinctive without trying to stand out. This shift terrifies the ego, which often built its entire structure on being special. Jung helped patients understand that releasing spiritual specialness doesn't diminish their consciousness. It reveals their consciousness as natural rather than achievement. Jung identified the third silent exit as abandoning what he called emotional performance, the exhausting pretense of perpetual positivity and spiritual transcendence of normal human emotional experience. Through his exploration of the shadow in psychology, Jung discovered that genuine spiritual development doesn't eliminate difficult emotions, it integrates them. The pressure to appear spiritually evolved often creates a new form of inauthenticity, spiritual bypassing through enforced positivity. Jung observed that awakening individuals slowly develop what he termed emotional authenticity and tolerance, an inability to fake feelings they don't genuinely experience. A spiritual teacher came to Jung after her son's death, destroyed her ability to maintain her enlightened persona. I built my career on being the peaceful, transcendent healer, she explained. After my loss, I tried to return to teaching with my spiritual mask intact, but my body wouldn't let me. I'd sit with students trying to radiate wisdom, and tears would just start falling. Jung helped her understand that her inability to perform happiness wasn't spiritual failure, it was spiritual maturity. Her authentic self was refusing to betray her genuine human experience for the sake of maintaining a spiritual image. Jung's analytical psychology reveals that emotional authenticity develops through several stages. Stage 1, performance fatigue, the constant effort to appear positive, peaceful, or spiritually transcendent becomes psychologically exhausting. You find yourself unable to maintain the energy required for emotional performance. Stage 2, body rebellion. Jung observed that the body often rebels against emotional inauthenticity before the mind recognizes it. You might find yourself unable to smile when you're sad, unable to speak positive affirmations when you're struggling, or unable to maintain your usual spiritual demeanor during difficult periods. Stage 3, authentic expression rather than fighting your genuine emotional state. You begin allowing authentic expression. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally uncontrolled, but allowing your real experience rather than your performed experience. Stage 4, integrated presence, the final stage Jung called integrated presence, the ability to be fully present with whatever emotional reality exists without needing to change, fix, or transcend it. Jung emphasized that this emotional authenticity doesn't make people negative or depressive. Instead, it makes their positive emotions genuine rather than performed. When they do experience joy, peace, or love, these emotions carry the depth and authenticity that only comes from someone who has also consciously experienced and integrated their shadow emotions. A Buddhist practitioner told Jung, "I spent years trying to transcend anger, fear, and sadness through meditation. When I stopped trying to transcend them and started experiencing them consciously, my meditation became 10 times deeper." Jung observed that people who successfully abandon emotional performance often report feeling more genuinely spiritual than when they were trying to maintain spiritual appearances. The fourth pattern Jung documented awakening souls abandon is what he called cognitive rigidity, the desperate need for certainty, fixed beliefs, and absolute answers about life's fundamental questions. Jung's philosophy emphasized that genuine wisdom involves what he termed holding paradox, the psychological capacity to remain comfortable with uncertainty and contradictory truths. He observed that spiritual awakening often leads to less certainty rather than more, creating profound discomfort for minds accustomed to solid ground. Through his study of the collective unconscious, Jung recognized that the need for certainty serves important psychological functions. Fixed beliefs provide identity, community, and the illusion of safety in an uncertain universe. However, Jung observed that spiritual maturity requires releasing this psychological dependence on knowing. A brilliant physicist came to Jung, experiencing what he called metaphysical vertigo, but after a profound awakening experience, all his scientific certainties had dissolved. "I used to know how the universe worked," he told Jung. "Now I realize I don't even understand how my coffee cup exists. The more conscious I become, the less certain I am about anything." Jung helped him understand that this wasn't confusion, but clarity. He was seeing past the illusion of knowledge into the reality of mystery. Jung documented that releasing certainty happens in predictable phases. Phase 1, doubt emergence. Previously solid beliefs begin feeling unstable. This creates anxiety because beliefs weren't just intellectual positions, they were psychological security systems. Phase 2, identity crisis. Many people derive their sense of self from their beliefs and knowledge. When these dissolve, they experience what Jung called cognitive identity death, not knowing who they are without their certainties. Phase 3, mystery acceptance. Gradually, the need to know transforms into appreciation for mystery. Jung observed that people in this phase develop what he called philosophical comfort with not knowing. Phase 4, wisdom emergence. The final phase involves what Jung termed lived wisdom, understanding that emerges from experience rather than belief. This wisdom is fluid, contextual, and comfortable with paradox. Jung noted that releasing certainty is particularly challenging for intellectually oriented people who built their identity around knowing. A university professor told Jung, "I defined myself by my knowledge. When that dissolved, I had to learn who I was beyond my PhD, beyond my expertise, beyond everything I thought made me valuable." Jung emphasized that abandoning certainty doesn't mean abandoning discernment. Instead, it means holding your conclusions lightly, remaining open to new information, and accepting that reality might be far more mysterious than any belief system can contain. One patient described his journey. "I used to have passionate opinions about everything: politics, spirituality, the meaning of life. Now, when someone asks what I believe, I honestly don't know. Not from confusion, but from openness. I've become more interested in questions than answers." Jung identified the fifth silent exit as abandoning what he called victim consciousness, not just blaming others for your circumstances, but the entire psychological framework that divides experience into victim and perpetrator narratives. Through his work with shadow integration, Jung discovered that blame serves crucial psychological functions. It preserves innocence, provides identity, explains suffering, and bonds us with others who share similar wounds. However, Jung observed that spiritual maturity requires transcending this framework entirely. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or bypassing legitimate trauma. Jung's approach to healing involved what he called radical responsibility, recognizing your unconscious participation in life patterns without self-blame or denial of others' harmful actions. A woman came to Jung carrying decades of justified grievances, abusive childhood, betraying partners, discriminating employers. Her anger was legitimate, her blame accurate. But Jung observed that her identification with being wronged had become her primary identity. "I was so attached to being the victim," she later told Jung, "that I unconsciously chose situations that confirmed that identity, not because I wanted to suffer, but because I didn't know who I was without my wounds." Jung documented that abandoning victim consciousness follows several psychological stages. Stage 1, justified anger, initial recognition of legitimate harm, abuse, or injustice. This stage is necessary for psychological integrity and shouldn't be bypassed. Stage 2, pattern recognition, beginning to notice recurring dynamics in relationships, work situations, or life circumstances. This isn't self-blame, but pattern awareness. Stage 3, unconscious participation, recognizing how you unconsciously contribute to recurring patterns without taking responsibility for others' harmful behavior. Jung called this shadow participation, seeing your unconscious role in dynamics without excusing others' actions. Stage 4, radical responsibility, taking complete responsibility for your response to life circumstances while maintaining clear boundaries about others' behavior. Jung observed this as the most psychologically mature position. Stage 5, transcendent perspective, viewing experiences as part of your soul's development rather than random victimization. Jung called this archetypal perspective, seeing life, events as meaningful rather than merely personal. Jung emphasized that this process often takes years and requires tremendous psychological courage. A man who spent decades blaming his father for his struggles described his transformation to Jung. "The day I stopped making him responsible for my life was the day I became responsible for my life, not because his behavior was acceptable, but because my freedom didn't depend on his change." Jung observed that people who successfully abandon victim consciousness don't become passive or accepting of abuse. Instead, they become powerfully discerning about what they will and won't tolerate, but their power comes from choice rather than reactivity. The sixth pattern Jung observed, awakening individuals. Abandon is spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts, practices, or beliefs to avoid genuine psychological and emotional development. Jung's depth psychology revealed that spiritual bypassing serves as a sophisticated defense mechanism, allowing people to maintain the appearance of consciousness, while avoiding the difficult work of shadow integration and authentic human experience. Through his extensive work with what he called the transcendent function, Jung understood that genuine spirituality involves integrating rather than transcending human experience. He observed that many spiritual practitioners used enlightenment concepts to escape rather than embrace their humanity. Jung documented common forms of spiritual bypassing, using meditation to avoid feeling difficult emotions, applying everything happens for a reason to bypass grief, employing we're all one to avoid personal boundaries, practicing ego death to escape psychological work. and utilizing detachment to avoid intimacy. A Buddhist monk came to Jung after 20 years of intensive practice. He had achieved remarkable meditative states and profound experiences of emptiness. But his personal relationships were disasters, and his emotional life was completely numbed. "I used enlightenment to bypass my humanity," he told Jung. "I thought spirituality was about transcending human experience. Now I realize it's about finally having human experience, being fully present to this particular life with all its messiness and beauty." Jung observed that abandoning spiritual bypassing requires what he called spiritual embodiment, the integration of transcendent awareness with full human experience. The process typically involves several stages. Stage 1, bypass recognition, becoming aware of how spiritual concepts or practices are being used to avoid rather than engage with psychological material. This recognition often comes through repeated relationship failures or persistent emotional numbness despite spiritual advancement. Stage 2, descent into humanity. Jung observed this as often more challenging than initial awakening. After touching infinite consciousness, individuals must learn to be finite again. After experiencing no self, they must develop healthy selfhood. Stage 3, integration work, doing the psychological work that was bypassed through spiritual practices. This often involves therapy, shadow work, and healing developmental trauma that enlightenment experiences hadn't actually resolved. Stage 4, embodied spirituality, the emergence of what Jung called incarnate consciousness, being fully human and fully spiritual simultaneously, using neither to escape the other. Jung noted that people who successfully abandon spiritual bypassing often report that their spirituality becomes more authentic rather than less profound. A yoga teacher told Jung, "When I stopped using yoga to escape my emotions and started using it to feel them more deeply, my practice became genuinely transformational rather than just transcendental." Jung emphasized that mature spirituality doesn't eliminate human needs, desires, or emotions. It consciously includes them. You can be awakened and still want intimate relationships. You can be enlightened and still feel anger. You can be conscious and still have preferences, boundaries, and personal desires. The final pattern Jung observed: awakening individuals. Abandon might seem counterintuitive, the identity of being too conscious for ordinary human connection. Jung's understanding of the individuation process revealed that while spiritual development often requires periods of solitude, genuine psychological maturity leads back to connection, but connection of a completely different quality. Jung documented that many awakening individuals develop what he called consciousness superiority, believing their awareness makes them fundamentally incompatible with unconscious people. This creates what appears to be spiritual isolation, but is actually psychological arrogance. A woman who had spent years in spiritual solitude came to Jung, describing her loneliness. "I thought I was alone because I was too awakened for others," she explained. "Then I realized I was alone because I was afraid of being seen in my non-enlightened moments, my struggles, my very human needs." Jung helped her recognize that her spiritual isolation was actually spiritual pride. She was using her consciousness development to avoid the vulnerability required for authentic intimacy. Jung observed that abandoning isolation identity involves several psychological shifts. Stage 1, superiority recognition, seeing how consciousness development has been used to feel superior to unconscious people rather than genuinely serving awakening. Stage 2, humility development, recognizing your own unconscious patterns, shadow material, and ongoing psychological work. This creates genuine humility rather than performed humility. Stage 3. Universal humanity. Understanding that everyone is doing their best from their current level of consciousness. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but creates compassion for the human condition. Stage 4. Conscious connection. Developing the ability to connect with anyone, regardless of their consciousness level. Not by lowering your awareness, but by embracing your shared humanity. Jung termed this final stage conscious relationship, the AC ability to be intimate without merging, love without attachment, and connect without losing yourself. A philosopher told Jung about his transformation. I used to think conscious people needed to be with conscious people. Now I realize conscious people can be with anyone because they're no longer trying to get anything from the relationship. They're just present with what is. Jung observed that people who successfully abandon isolation identity often become bridges between different levels of consciousness, helping others awaken not through teaching but through embodied presence. Jung's comprehensive study of these 7 patterns revealed something profound about the nature of spiritual development and personal growth. These exits aren't conscious choices initially. They're what he called psychological necessities, driven by the individuation process. Jung's analytical psychology shows that as your authentic self emerges through consciousness development, it naturally rejects anything incompatible with its essential nature. This isn't willpower or discipline, it's psychological evolution. Understanding these patterns, Jung believed, helps people navigate the disorientation of awakening. When you can no longer engage with life the way you used to, when familiar patterns suddenly feel impossible, when you seem to be losing interest in things that once motivated you, you're not becoming depressed or antisocial. You're becoming authentic. Jung observed that these exits typically occur over years, rather than months, and they often happen in waves rather than linear progression. You might abandon approval seeking in relationships, but still catch yourself performing for professional validation. You might release the need for certainty about spiritual matters, but still cling to certainty about practical concerns. This is normal, Jung emphasized. The individuation process respects the psyche's need for gradual change rather than traumatic upheaval. Jung also noted that these exits often create temporary isolation because fewer people can relate to someone who has abandoned these common psychological patterns. This isolation, however, is temporary. As more people undergo similar awakening processes, new forms of conscious community naturally emerge. Jung wanted awakening individuals to understand that these 7 exits create space for something far more authentic and satisfying to emerge. You're not just losing old patterns, you're making room for your genuine self to live. When you exit approval-seeking, inherent self-worth emerges. When you abandon spiritual specialness, authentic uniqueness flowers. When you quit emotional performance, genuine feeling develops. When you release certainty addiction, lived wisdom unfolds. When you transcend victim consciousness, personal power activates. When you abandon spiritual bypassing, integrated presence emerges. When you exit isolation identity, conscious connection becomes possible. Jung called this the alchemy of individuation, transforming psychological lead into spiritual gold through the conscious release of what was never truly yours. This process, Jung observed, serves not just individual development, but collective evolution. As more people undergo these silent exits, new forms of human relationship and community become possible. You're not just awakening for yourself, you're pioneering new ways of being human. Jung emphasized tremendous patience and self-compassion during this process. These exits can feel like loss, disorientation, or even failure. Your ego will interpret the dissolution of familiar patterns as death, which in a psychological sense it is. But Jung's life work demonstrated that this death is always followed by rebirth, not into someone new, but into who you've always authentically been, beneath the layers of conditioning and performance. If Jung's insights about these 7 silent exits resonate with your experience, you're part of a global awakening that's quietly transforming human consciousness. Subscribe to this channel for more explorations of analytical psychology, the individuation process, and Jung's revolutionary insights into spiritual development. Share this video with someone who might be experiencing their own silent exits, and let me know in the comments which of these 7 patterns you recognize in your own awakening journey. Remember, these exits aren't loss, they're liberation. Every pattern you release creates space for something more authentic to emerge. You're not losing yourself, you're finally finding yourself.